JayEmm on Cars is sponsored by Car Vertical. With just a registration number, or even better, a VIN, Car Vertical will search over 20 European databases to find out whether any car you're looking at has a hidden past. They can see if a vehicle was used as a taxi, stolen, suffered fire damage, or involved in a crash, even when it wasn't written off, so could pass other checks. Car Vertical is now an essential tool in my car buying kit, putting all the information I need to know together in one easy-to-read report. Even better, if you follow the link in the description down below, you'll get 10% off. A big thank you to them for being today's sponsor. Hello everybody, and welcome today to another video on yet another very fine Porsche, courtesy of my good friends George and Caitlin. I have met many Porsche people and they're all somewhat peculiar. This is not a bad thing at all, I'm a peculiar chap myself, but there is always an argument to be had as to which is the best of their cars. And let's be honest here, that's part of the fun of being a petrol head, isn't it? Debating as to who's got the best or which is the most desirable, etc, etc. And then realizing at the end of the day, none of it actually matters at all because we all just love cars. Now, in the Porsche world, you won't even get people to agree which model is the best, but I would say the 911 is the one which has become the most iconic. However, the 911 has now been around for so long that its fans have become somewhat tribalistic. You'll get those who'll still swear blind that anything with water in it is the work of the devil. And you'll also find plenty who'll tell you that all of the old stuff really isn't worth bothering with and will break down. Myself, I sort of flip between the whole lot and I find some joy in most of them. This week I've been able to sample a few different 911s from different generations, but getting in a 993 is always a very, very special thing. About a decade ago, I convinced my mother to purchase a slightly tired example from our local Porsche dealer, and we spent quite a bit of time and money mildly restoring it. We then sold it on and made a small loss, and if I told you how much we sold it for, you would be absolutely mortified because that price wouldn't get you anywhere close to even a ropey one now. In fact, for the price we sold our 993 for, if you were to buy one that cheap now, you'd have to put the fire out yourself. Once upon a time, the 993 was seen as more or less the holy grail of 911s, and it will always have a special place as the last of the air-cooled cars. But its styling was perhaps a little bit too much for some. Those rounded lines betrayed that classic 911 look, and so today, the 964 more or less seems to have taken its place as perhaps the ultimate 911. However, the 993 also brought us this. The 911 Turbo. The Turbo wasn't a new thing. In fact, by the time this rolled around, the Turbo had been bothering roads for I think about 2 decades. But the early cars were somewhat tricky so-and-sos and quickly gained a reputation for being widowmakers, thanks in part to, for the time, very, very healthy power outputs, rear-wheel drive, and somewhat spiky power delivery. The 993 sought to put this right, and in many ways this car is a real bridge between the last of the air-cooled and the first of the water-cooled. You're gonna have to excuse me though, because this car has a sunroof, and I want to experience... yes, that's much better. And I can see it's improved the light for you as well, so hopefully it's a win-win for us both. I apologise for the extra wind noise, but I want to savour every moment in this car and say a big thank you to its owner Roland, who's brought it out to me. He's previously also brought me his 964 RS, so he's a man that has some very nice examples of 911s, but also isn't afraid to use them, or importantly for me, share them with others. Now this car actually has just over 50,000 miles on it, and he's only the second owner. But if you told me this was a 5,000 mile example, I would believe you. It's absolutely immaculate and looks spectacular in this colour combination of midnight blue with a blue and tan leather interior. Really wonderful, this car. Absolutely delightful. It even looks fairly diminutive now and somewhat reserved compared to the later turbos, which became just almost a parody of themselves. Still, for the time, this was a big old beastie, having an engorged rear section, which was a bit of a turbo trademark. The car also came with an absolutely enormous and very necessary wing on it. That wing's not just there for aerodynamics, it also gives the car somewhere to hide an enormous intercooler, and that helps keep the pair of turbochargers here in check. Power output for this car, by the standards of today, a fairly modest 408 horsepower. There was also a power pack you could get, which took things up to about 430, or you could have the Turbo S, which made around 450 horses. This isn't actually the first time that I've driven a 993 Turbo. About 8 years ago, I got to take one out for a local Porsche specialist who was selling one, and I was going to take some photos for them. When I got in the car, I was told, by the way, watch out, because it's got the power pack on it, so it's about 430 horsepower. And back then, I was like, oh, 430 horsepower, that's a heck of a lot. I hadn't really driven anything more than about 300 horsepower in my life. So I thought, right, I'm going to be very careful, very gentle, very respectful of this car and what it's capable of. And what I'm going to do, get it nice and warm, get it in a straight line, and give it some beans. So I did just that. I got it onto a straight, and I put my foot down at about 2,000 RPM. Nothing. 2.5, nothing. 3, nothing. 3, 250, nothing. 3.5, and you just heard bang! And this thing shot me towards the horizon like nothing I'd ever experienced. Before you knew it, 6,500 RPM came around, you had to change gear, and then the process started over again. Oh my word. You caught that thing off boost, absolutely useless. You may as well be cycling. But on boost, it was truly savage. I had never in my life experienced anything like it. A week later, I found out that somebody had spent about £11,000 tuning that car, and it made not 430 horsepower, but 550. And it came with a dyno graph that sort of went like that. Very spiky car. This one seems much more mild-mannered, but I haven't yet put my foot down. Much more progressive, this car. Gonna slowly ramp up the speed. The thing's getting warm. These do take their time. There's a lot of oil in them, so to get it properly to temp does take a little while. And you know what? I'm not gonna rush things. I am gonna really savor and enjoy this car because it's an absolute delight. And there were several things introduced with the 993 generation Turbo that were significant. The biggest was the introduction of all-wheel drive. It was the first Turbo sold as such, although not the first 911. Porsche had been doing all-wheel drive 911s for a few years by then. This was no doubt inspired by the 959 supercar that Porsche made a few years earlier. That car in and of itself was really a test bed to see just how far Porsche could stretch the 911 platform, and they found out actually they could take it a lot further than they thought. These days it seems to be the GT products which are most sought after, but for so very long the Turbo really was the 911 holy grail. Oh yes, what a thing. This car's natural rival would probably have been the Ferrari 355, a car in which I have quite a bit of experience. And I can agree with the road tests of the time, which say that a 355 simply wouldn't be able to keep up with this. Because it wouldn't. This is really quite a quick car, and I've only just scratched the surface. A world first, apparently, for this car was the introduction of the OBD2 diagnostics port, which is quite useful, although it's very early implementation of the technology. This was something that was introduced and is still on cars to this very day, and the idea was it was designed to make things a little bit easier for consumers. Stock manufacturers coming out with proprietary systems, meaning you had to take cars back to your dealerships. The 911 Turbo's reputation does seem to be a fairly amorphous one. Like I said, when it came out, it was a real heartbreaking widowmaker of a car with a take-no-prisoners reputation. But now it's seen really as a sort of gentleman's express, and in some ways people forget about the Turbo because it's the GT cars that really do get all the limelight. The fact is, for an awfully long time, people have been lusting after GT3s, when in reality the Turbo was probably a more appropriate car, because when it came to track times, a Turbo was actually just as quick. The difference was it could do it with a nice sound system, nice aircon, comfy seats, and the rest of it. This car is not exactly a flyweight, despite being one of the old air-cooled cars. It tips the scale still at about 1,500 kilos. But it absolutely, positively does not feel out of date. She does move around in that real classic 911 way. The steering feels really tight in this car. Not the most feelsome. I think that all-wheel drive system has corrupted it a little bit. Other 993s I've driven seem to be a little bit more alive, but then some of those have been quite heavily modified. This is a standard car. Revs really keenly though. This engine, so good. Turbo lag, once you're on it, really minimal. It's a very, very impressive setup. And one thing Roland was keen to tell me is that this notion these old 911s are easy to run, bulletproof and cheap to maintain is utter twaddle, because they just aren't. This is something I've heard from quite a few people now. I've spoken to a number of people who've looked at, say, a classic Ferrari and thought, no, I can't really afford one of those, I'll go get an old 911 instead. The truth is, if you couldn't afford to run, say, a Ferrari 360, or you don't think you could afford to run one, you probably couldn't afford to run an old air-cooled 911 either. They will need rebuilds, they will need work. One particular issue with the 993 Turbo is the fact that dealers apparently never specified the right grade of oil. They want you to use 0W40, and Roland, and many others, feel that's just not right for these cars, particularly as they now all have miles in and are somewhat warm. He knows of several which have required rebuilds because Porsche dealers keep putting this stuff in. Porsche themselves actually then came out with a Porsche Classic oil formulation, which is 10W60, and that, he feels, is then too thick. So speak with your specialist as to what you think is the right thing to do, but tread with some caution when it comes to something as simple as putting oil in the car. As it happens, these are dry sump like all 993s, and so there's plenty of oil in this thing. So really, I'd never worry about one of these running low on oil. Be much more wary of overfilling it. I don't know how much this car is worth, and quite honestly, I don't want to know. The last time I drove a Turbo, it was priced at, back then, probably quite an optimistic £55,000. I do know that Damien from the Car Guys just spent 100 grand on a 993 C4S. Very nice example though, which he picked up from Scotland incidentally. And a Turbo is probably going to be worth a bit more than that. Rides the road so well. It's got grip because of that all-wheel drive system. The 6-speed gearbox is really nice. You can heel and toe easily, and this engine is so much better than I expected it to be. Not just the power of it, because that was always a given, but the responsiveness, the fact it really does move under you and you can work with it and you can drive it around like a sports car. Sensational. In typical air-cooled Porsche fashion, you'll find buttons placed just about anywhere they can find a space for them in the cockpit. It's a somewhat odd layout. I've more or less gotten used to it over time, but intuitive it is not. Brakes are really good too. In fact, I do recall the 993 Turbo being notable for the power of its brakes. 911s in general actually always did fairly well on the old brake front. There's some really nice details you find in this car too, like for example the rear seats, which are not particularly useful. If you fold them down, you'll still find a turbo motif on the carpets. Although the rear seats aren't very good for storing people, if you fold the little section down, you'll find a small little lip. And the section you're left with is almost exactly the correct size for a crate of beer. Those crazy Germans. I wasn't sure what to think of this, because you see, the 996 Turbo, I don't really think the turbo element added that much to it. And I'm a real fan of the regular 993. It's sensational, one of my favourite 911s. This definitely loses just a little bit of that feel, that interaction, that lightness of steering. But the engine actually is really quite exciting, and in 1996 this must have felt immensely rapid, because it's still quick now. Oddly, these are actually also a little bit easier to drive than the regular car, because the normal 993 didn't get a hydraulically assisted clutch, and so they're quite heavy, whereas these did. So actually your clutch pedal in this, really surprisingly light and easy. If you are in the fortunate position to be able to buy a 993 of any description really, I would highly recommend getting a specialist to check it over and budget in the first year or so to spend probably £5,000 to £10,000 on it, and hopefully you won't really need to be spending anywhere near that much. After that, you do intend to use the car, just make sure you've got a couple of grand a year aside for servicing and the odd bit here and there that will need doing. Like an old Ferrari really, or indeed anything of this era with this kind of performance, if you stamp on those small problems as they appear, you'll stop any bill from ever being scarily large. Yeah, the turbo really comes in from about 3,500 to 4 grand onwards, and to 6.5, it's a really strong car. Below that it doesn't have an awful lot, but that's okay, and the crossover from no turbo to turbo is managed really quite well. Very smooth, very linear, a lot friendlier than the last one of these that I drove. Not really very much noise out of this, it's standard exhaust and really a standard car all round. But my life, what an utter and total delight this thing is. I love it to pieces. Thank you, Roland, for bringing it out. This has been a real, genuine treat. Coming towards the end of my visit to Scotland now, I've got one last car to do, and that one is a Porsche of a very different nature, but I'm equally as excited to drive. So I hope you'll join me for that video. All that remains now is for me to say thank you for watching. Please like, comment down below, and of course, subscribe if you haven't already. Bye-bye.